Okay, hi everyone. Thanks for the minutes there. Hello everyone. As many of you might know, I'm Florencia Librizzi. I'm Head of Program and Partnership at the SCG Academy at the United Nations Sustainable Development Solutions Network. I have my office in New York, but I live in New Jersey with my family, and I'm delighted to bring you on here with John's request of this warm welcome for all of you, especially to those that is the first time that gather today with us and with the GRLI. Apart from my many roles and being a mother of 3 young kids, I'm actually, I feel like a new friend of, or not so new friend of GRLI and new guardian, I would like to say, but been collaborating with GRLI for a long time. And so thank you so much, John, for bringing us together, but also for inviting me to be part of this group. So let's start with just sharing some context for today's work, for the opportunity of having everyone in these pod gatherings. And I like to start, as requested Jeff, with a couple of points. First is about GRLI, and I am not the best person to talk about this. I know that there are many more people experiencing these calls about GRLI, including obviously John. But what I would say that is quite important is that GRLI has started to conduct this permanent inquiry and asking ourselves, what is global responsibility and how might be developed? So this is clearly an ongoing collaborative inquiry that is being held by deeply engaged international multi-sector community of partners and associates. Many of you obviously here today, but also the plus ones that you're bringing with different perspectives to join this conversation. So this really comprises companies, universities, business schools, transnational networks, and NGOs. This is a result of, I think, multi-year relationships between United Nations and business schools, including the UN Global Compact, EFMD, and in this memorandum of understanding that was launched in 2003. So in addition to that group, obviously they're full of different partners that are collaborating in the governance and direction setting responsibilities, from the boards to different partners, strategic partners like AACSB, EFMD, UN Global Compact, Oikos International, body that brings students and youth, and others. So this is really about GRLI. What about the GRLI Guardians? And that's where I was saying that I was invited last year to join in, and I'm happy to be part of this group. So as part of our work as Guardians, we coming, of course, GRLI as a nonprofit has a legal structure and a board that is legally and financially responsible for the foundation. But then there are many other groups like the Guardian Group, and the partners and others that provide some support in terms of shaping the vision, mission, operating ethos, and so on. Because we all know about GRLI is really concerned about values, the guiding principles, and the way that we work. So this is really about the why, the what, and how we operate in the world, and we bring global responsibility leadership to our world. So back to what are we doing today? Well, today is really about this pod and these gatherings. So in keeping GRLI guiding principles of think big, start small, and act now. And I will say it again because I think this is very important. Think big, start small, but act now. So there's a really three, I think, important aspects to the work is we're conducting these small informal group gatherings with partners, with associate representatives, now open to other wonderful colleagues that we have that can bring different perspectives to really build on that shared learning on global responsibility leadership. And to also have a touch point between the key events of GRLI, being mostly the assembly and also the town hall gatherings, and being able to really grow that knowledge collectively. So this month, pod is really about, again, bringing the partners and associates, but also external people that can help us to bring the diversity. And I think the key question here is to bring that. I will quote here John's word because I think there, I wouldn't do it well otherwise, is richer tapestry of perspective on developing global responsibility. So the intention is really to have an open collaboration, conversation, without necessarily arrive to predetermined outcomes. So it's about hearing different voices that are not necessarily typically heard, or at least not in this group, and expand that notion. And not from our usual contributors. So anyway, so I'm very much looking forward to this conversation, to hearing from all of you, to learning more. And I think I will pass it on now to John to discuss more of the agenda. And again, welcome to everyone, and thank you for also having me, John.
Thank you very much, Florencia. Thank you for that warm welcome. So my name, for those of you I haven't met, my name is John North. I'm the Executive Director of the GRLI, and also from my side, on behalf of the core team, you're very, very welcome. In addition to what Florencia said, I might add one or two things. At a previous pod gathering, our partners and associates discussed a call to action that was recently published by a number of, or co-signed by a number of Nobel laureates. It was a call for planetary stewardship, or as we've been referring to it for the last 2 decades, global responsibility. And one of the breakout discussions during our pod gathering was focused on the question of who is missing from that call to action. We asked ourselves which voices need to be heard and reflected in the context of developing global responsibility. Then in a later discussion among the Guardian group, one of our other Guardians, Rumina Dalla, pointed out that one key part of including and hearing other perspectives and voices is about listening more carefully when those voices are present. So today is not only about making the circle bigger, but also, I guess, about appreciative listening. Hence, we asked our partners and associates to bring a +1 to the conversation, which could be someone representing a critical or unheard perspective. And so it's wonderful to see around the room a number of faces and human beings, I should say, because it's more than just your face, hopefully, that you bring to today's work. Our intention always is, as Florencia said, is to keep it open for exploration. There are no predetermined outcomes. If you want to learn more about the GRLI's ongoing collaborative inquiry, you're more than welcome to contact me. Ultimately, what we do in the pod gathering is less about the GRLI and more about the larger body of work that we exist to serve. So I'm going to just briefly run you through the agenda or the flow for today's meeting. We're going to kick off with small group conversations. We will likely have somewhere between 7 and 9 people per group for around 40 minutes. When you get into that group, there will be an opportunity just to briefly introduce yourself. And that introduction may simply include, who you are, where you're joining from, and what brings you to the conversation. And then following the round of brief introductions so that we can focus on the conversation, and we'll obviously get to know each other better. We're going to hold the question, how might we help carry, enable, and amplify the contribution from voices and perspectives that are typically not heard? And I'll repeat that briefly. But basically, we recognize that in catalyzing the development of global responsibility, there are voices and perspectives that are not heard. And we're asking ourselves how we might help carry, enable, and amplify that contribution. We'll then come out of the small group discussions. We'll hold around 20 minutes for feedback in plenary from the small groups, basically to hear anything from the small groups discussion that will be useful to hear in the plenary context. and then we'll have another 15 minutes of plenary discussion. Another way of thinking about the 3 stages of today's work is that we start with all of us in the small groups, because we're bringing perspectives from different organizations and contexts. We then, towards the end of our small group discussion, start to form a notion of the we, which is held in the small group. So we'll debrief the we then in plenary. And then as we close in reflections, there may be some individual reflections that come up. So for those of you who are not familiar with the GRLI's work, our understanding of global responsibility, or at least our emergent understanding of it, is that it works and requires work at 3 levels: the I, the we, and the all of us, or the individual, the organizational, and the systemic. So we're gonna touch on all 3 of those today. Okay, so I'm just looking at the numbers before we open the rooms for the breakouts. We're going to have breakout rooms of 7. Now I'm going to allow you to choose your room. So you will be pre-assigned to a room. If you get into a room and you realize that you may be better suited in terms of your own contribution in another room, you're welcome to come back into the plenary and pick another room. But indicatively, we should have about 6 or 7 people per room, okay? The reason I'm doing this is that I know that some of you brought along a +1 or a colleague, and maybe you don't want to be in the same group, and maybe you want to split your efforts across groups. So I've tried as far as possible to ensure that that is the case, but you have the opportunity to step out of your room and to go into another room. Okay, so just give me a minute. I'm just checking. Claire Summer, I know that you are currently on the injury list. We're very happy to know that you are here today, Claire Summer. And I know you're keeping your video off following your broken ankle accident. I'm just checking, Claire, are you able to hear me? Just in case you can perhaps assist with moving the...
Absolutely, John. I'm here and ready to help however I can.
Okay, wonderful. I just want to make sure that you're there as a backup as well. And thanks so much, and all the best with your recovery. Okay, so let me just quickly do this. Okay, I'm going to open the rooms. Sorry, just give me a sec. We just need to recreate them. Okay. Okay. So that's 40 minutes. And I'll paste into the chat and into the broadcast the question we're holding. In a second. Go. Okay, wonderful. So welcome back, everyone. So we have about 30 minutes on the call, and the space we're going to hold now will be to hear from the smaller groups, and it doesn't have to be a complete word by word report back. What we're encouraging to do, and it doesn't have to be one person either, you're more than welcome to have multiple contributors to sharing, is to hear anything from the small group discussion that may be useful to hear in plenary. Anything surprising, anything useful, or maybe any new questions that arose as a result of the first round of small group discussions. And we're going to hold roughly 15 minutes, which means that we'll try and hear around 5 minutes from each group. If we go a little bit over, it won't be a problem, but it will then kind of start impeding on our individual reflections as a result of what we hear. So that would be the next step. And I'm asking anyone from any of the groups who's happy to kick off to please take the mic and go ahead. And just as a reminder, sorry for those who've joined us late, the question we were working with, or that we're working with today, in catalyzing the development of global responsibility, what voices and perspectives are not heard? How might we help carry, enable, and amplify their contribution? So.
Would you like me to say something about group 2?
Yeah, Carol, you're welcome.
You were all looking at me from my just Zoom. I think our deeper conversations were catalyzed by Gita saying, why would, no, Arnold starting off by saying that people from the south of Africa have not continued to join in on these conversations, and why didn't they come back? And Gita then challenged by saying, well, why would they come back? You know, and that led to a deeper conversation with many different contributions about the systems, processes and structures that prevent people, and also the emotional energy that it takes to have the courage to challenge. So it's not just about inviting people, it's about what are the mechanisms by which those voices can be heard, because it's not just a simple identifying and then that bring them in, because they may have had a history of being rejected, of being, or not even feeling able to speak up in the first place, or that their view hasn't been listened to or wouldn't be listened to. And as Gita said, their inputs are like gold, and yet they're not treated like that. And Bob gave us a really nice history of how many conventions, you know, going back to 1948, have there been where it's been identified that the missing voices are the things that need to be prioritized. And yet that doesn't happen, you know, time and time again. And so it's understanding something about that. And a couple of things I mentioned, it kind of reminded me of the Shell case in the Niger Delta, of saying where Shell would talk about their stakeholders, and someone pointed out, well, actually, haven't you thought that it's the community that's at the center of this, and you're just one of those stakeholders? And, you know, you need to think of it and those missing voices, maybe the people that we're missing are the people who should be prioritized at the center, not the people who are leading, because the way that sometimes things are framed means that it again goes back to the perspectives and narrative of those who are in dominance or in power in the situation. And the quote I mentioned that Claire asked me to share with you was, I wrote a paper many years ago called CSR for the Undeserving, because of being fed up of kind of CSR being, particularly by companies, of being seen as something that's for deserving causes and deserving people. And I was doing work with ex-offenders, former prisoners, trying to rehabilitate. And it was based on a framing by Walzer, which is, in what kind of society are lives best led? And that is one where all members of that community can make a contribution and are not excluded. And therefore we have a much healthier and a much more vibrant society.
Thanks, Carol.
Please add in anything else I've missed from what people were saying.
Maybe if I can just come in there very briefly, Carol, before we move on to hearing from others. When you do join in terms of contributing, please just share very briefly who you are. Carol, maybe you could just quickly tell, because since we had this meeting.
Yeah, I'm Carol, I'm from England. I'm actually based at the University of Winchester. Been involved in GRLI for a few years, but many other organisations on this agenda previously. Sorry.
Thanks, Carol. Okay, anyone from Carol's group too that would like to add what she's just shared?
Yeah, sorry, Bob, go.
No, please. No.
Well, this is good. This is a good example of whose voices are heard and whose voices are quietened. Thank you. I'll do it very quickly. Claire Maxwell, Associate Director with the Oasis School of Human Relations and Chair of the, currently honoured to be Chair of the GRLI. For me, it was part of what you were saying, Bob, about the system, how the system perpetuates the inequalities and prejudices and discriminations. And so it raised questions for me about what is the nature of the system that we are ourselves part of. And then Arnold's question at the end about, in order to be able to listen and hear what is being said from voices that are not heard, how do we quieten the voices that are frequently heard? So that for me was, I think, two very valuable contributions, and I hope I haven't misquoted you. Thank you.
I think Bob wanted to say something as well. Did
Yeah,
you?
Bob, please go ahead. Yeah.
Well, it was really to the point of that people who look like me need to talk less.
But I will also challenge that a bit, Bob, because I know you and I know your work and I know your passion and your heart on these issues. So sometimes, you know, it's actually quite important to have champions like you that will lift up the other and will bring those unheard voices to the table.
Exactly.
How many groups were we, John?
So there were 3 groups.
3? Okay.
It would be wonderful to hear from others as well.
I'm turning. We were. It was Armand, Danielle, John, Mary. Where's Kathy? Is Kathy?
She's. I think she's had to go.
Oh,
Yeah, Kathy mentioned that she had to go on the hour, unfortunately.
oh, she had to go on the hour. Okay.
She's gone to take the action she promised.
Yeah, she did. She had quite a few. Yeah, she had quite a few ideas about that. Who's going to go? Can you start, Mary, or who?
Well, I was wondering, given that I'm a voice that's frequently heard, I would love to hear from Armand.
Yeah.
Because I think that in terms of catalyzing where we got from the conversation, it was
Absolutely.
Armand's contribution. Is that okay?
Mary, did I make that significant a contribution?
When you talked about, I've written it down. You talked about acknowledge, the 3.
Yeah. So if I can just share that, Anders asked the question in terms of what's happened and transpired in South Africa and how it is that we would address the inequalities within our society. And I suggested that that there were at least 3 considerations for myself, having thought about this. And the first one of which was that over the last, I think it's 26 years of our democracy, what we've failed, what we haven't done really well is acknowledge where our failures have been as individuals, within organizations, and then also just systemically. In acknowledging those failures, one can then plot a better way forward. And I think, where we find ourselves currently, and I'm not sure if you've been following what's happened in the last few weeks within South Africa, that's indicative of that spilling over. And I fondly refer to it in terms of the strain that's occurring within the social contract. Then in terms of the second aspect was really how it is that over a period of time, we have become less comfortable with having uncomfortable conversations and discourse. And I think that's important. We need to get back to that stage of where it is that we can have these difficult, deep conversations, hold people's ideas and thoughts. Doesn't mean that we have to accept them, but we must be able to develop that ability to see where people are coming from. I think to a large degree have lost that. And then the third point I was making was that we need to really develop and get back to assisting individuals and in the classroom setting as well, and organizations, with engendering empathy. We've lost that to a large degree. And I think, if I just extend that, I think if we look at those three aspects, there's another one, it's restoring trust. We've lost so much trust within society that there's so much more work for us to do within in our context. So that was what I was referring to in terms of our particular context.
Thank you. And I think that then triggered a conversation, something that Kathy brought in, which was it the Vedic principle, Kathy? The known, the knower, and the not known. So this idea, this really struck me, this idea that you need to be, in order to properly listen to others, you have to put down your judgment, and you need to find out, you need to be curious, you need to get to know the person that knows something, and then recognize where things aren't known and be able to have those conversations. So I felt that that was quite an important point. I don't know if you want to embellish on that, Kathy.
Kathy left.
We had to drop off.
Oh,
another-
Kathy that's gone.
Didn't
Sorry.
advance
No,
it. Yeah.
Yeah.
But what you said, Mary, I think just to elaborate a little bit on it, that what we need, if we go to education, which is a key issue in all of this, but that we can put that aside for the time being. But you got to deal with both the known, and we're so good at the known. We're less equipped and good at handling the knower and the knowing the process. And when I think about that, I also think about that inclusiveness. The way we deal with it is so very, very often on just a face level, and we're not really able to listen, hear, and understand with interest and curiosity, as you mentioned, to the extent that is needed. And unfortunately, the way the world looks like now, being born 1950 and being probably the one of the elderly in the group here, it's amazing for the first time in my life over the last whatever years, experiencing that what used to be a common denominator, which was a belief in the common good and the value of that, the value of doing good and doing right, that is now threatened by a different sort of belief system, which is also about doing good, and but based on fundamentally different appreciations of what the world looks like and what's needed. And I wonder about that, and I'm turning to Bob then. If you're thought about the systemic things, issues around this, because it's really, it's a scary situation right now, because we're not just on the micro level kind of poorly equipped, but we're also facing a world where segregation is playing out, and where differences in beliefs and in values are the way we interpret values, we may use the same word, is becoming different. And I've never really experienced that to the extent that it's happening right now. And it includes the geopolitical situation as well, of course. So when we think big, act small, start now, I'm a little bit struggling about, thinking big, I can do that, but then I return to my ideals and beliefs. But acting small, starting now, I struggle with seeing where to begin.
Thanks, Anders. Anyone else from group 2? Just sorry, I don't know if that was group 2 or 3, but anyone else from that group, just so that we can get a flavor of what was discussed in the smaller groups before we move.
John and Danielle.
Okay.
John and Danielle.
Yeah, sure. I think I was mentioning that I think there needs to be more focus on changing the education system before it gets to tertiary education, that we need to be instilling values or virtues and behaviors from a very early age. And I don't think we can rely, the whole thing is a circle. And it's a question of, where do you puncture that balloon first? Do you puncture it at the leadership level? Do you do it at the tertiary education level, or do you do it at the primary level? Do you do it with the parents? It's a very difficult to know that, but I just got a feeling that we need to start with very base, with 2- and 3-year-olds when they start when they first go to school, with the social skills and community and so on and so forth, because otherwise we'll never get the leaders that we need in future generations.
Mm-hmm. Thanks, John. And I see Danielle's got to drop off, but she agrees with you. So wonderful. So then just moving on to the final group, the one that was.
Yeah, maybe I can just start with Xenia and Salma and I. We lost a couple of our members, had to drop off, and let me just give a little overview, and then Xenia and Salma, please. We started talking about really the question of the commitment or the experience of business in business education being committed to the common good, having impact related to the common good, or broader than just profitability, and whether or not that's really experienced. And so we shared experiences of both gaps and impact that we've seen in the business community related to that. And that led to a discussion about business education and essentially intrinsic and extrinsic motivations as being prompts in business education, and really the way in which business education does, could, should engage the whole person or the whole heart. Then we started talking about the question of voices, and one observation that was shared was that even the construct of the question seems to come from a Western framework of the agency of the individual as the primary construct, as opposed to the question of the impact of the method resulting in social good or community good, and the individual as a part of that, if I'm capturing that properly. And so that was a powerful dimension. And then we shared about our experiences both in academia and in business related to the ways in which these questions have been engaged and experienced. So with my colleagues, if anything, please add, expand.
I think I'll go. So I think part of that discussion, which was also looking at the question of accessibility. So, you know, the point of having a voice means there's some level of accessibility to the platform at which you can actually sort of display that voice. And what we often found, or certainly from my experience, is that many of these conversations happen outside of developing countries. So when I think about a lot of the work that I do in Africa, these conversations don't necessarily take place here, which means that the voices are kind of excluded just by the fact that it's not within a geographical location or easily accessible. With the advent of everything moving digital, you know, during COVID time, what we have started seeing is that there are a lot more voices coming forward based on the fact that there's a bit more accessibility from a digital perspective, and that's something to potentially build on, or to really think about, you know, when we talk about the platforms and how you can bring voices in. And I think the other interesting part was, I think it was Otti that spoke about how, you know, the methods and what is your kind of theory of change, really? What are you trying to achieve by bringing the voices to the table? And that's an interesting one to talk about as well. And then I think the third one was about, when you say bring voices to the table, you know, what are you talking about aggregate, you know, in terms of voices? What types of voices are you wanting there? Is it representation in a broad sense, or are you really looking for potential influences, or, you know, people that are going to move this forward quite quickly? So it's about getting a little bit clearer in that respect. Xenia?
Thank you, Salma and Jeff. it was fascinating discussion. So much was mentioned. I'm just struggling to pull the conversation back together. There's so many points. And on the cross-cultural point, which I think I raised, I think we thought about the bridging concepts. So how do we make this question relevant to everybody? And how do we enable people to bring their voices in, even though the question of voices will not come to them naturally? And I'm mostly talking about Asian countries, which are not as individualistic, and that question would not occur to them. So, and what came to my mind was the definition of global development, which has systemic in it many times, I think, when you read the bullet points. And actually systemic theory, I thought was very important in helping us bridge and understand, you know, what is the concept of voice, what is a system, what are the boundaries, and even in the student communities, we spoke about student communities and business schools, some of them not even having, you know, much of curriculum that explains what systemic actually means, you know, how it's different from holistic and other related concepts. And perhaps that's something that would enable people to take courage, to understand that they have a voice and to actually speak it and bring it in, whatever culture they belong to. Otti raised a question of commons, and it made us wonder, you know, how much global development happens in commons and how much of it happens in private spaces. And of course, then talking about commons, we're talking about physical commons, or are we talking about digital commons? And then, of course, to Salma's point about access to digital commons online, synchronous, asynchronous, all the questions of process and enablement. It's quite technical, but it really does matter, as the past couple of years have shown. So I think I'll stop here and I'll ask you to mention if there's anything that I've missed out. Anybody else from the group? Thank you.
So thanks, Xenia, and your colleagues also for sharing that. For the remaining few minutes, 10 minutes or so, having heard from the other groups, and I know that everyone is very sensitive now to speaking up too soon, since we're encouraging appreciative listening, but please do not be shy. Yeah, we're just going to hold a few minutes to hear any reflections emerging from what you've heard from the other groups, or maybe any new insights or thoughts that came to mind that would be worthwhile sharing. Just before I mute myself again, maybe just one brief reflection from my side. I think, you know, as a relatively small entity, we recognize that we can never, in our own composition of the GRLI, we can never be diverse and inclusive enough in our own composition necessarily. We can certainly try to create the space where we can to hear other reflections, perspectives, and certainly I think in the coming months it's going to be something that you know, as we kind of reach capacity at partnership level, we need to seriously think about how do we ensure that you know, that we are very specific, as Salma said, about which voices needs to be heard and how to enable them to be heard. So I'm just gonna leave that there. But any final reflections? It'd be wonderful to hear what you've heard from what the other groups are saying.
I'd just like to say on a positive note that I think this kind of conversation would have been very unlikely 15, 20 years ago. So, I mean, I think we are, you know, progress is being made. And even though we're perhaps going back to the ancient, you know, wisdom for a lot of what we're talking about, in the sense that there's nothing, you know, almost nothing new on the planet. I think that we're having these open conversations amongst a broader number of people, rather than being sort of booed off the stage. I think is a positive.
John, maybe I think what was helpful for me when I, in our group, started the conversation about something that I constantly have put on the table over quite some time in our GRLI conversations, was this kind of absence of the global south and the coming and going and so on. And then somebody said, but you know what, this is more broadly the case. This is more about a more global phenomenon. It's happening across other similar channels. And in a sense, it was comforting for me because to realize that this is a bigger challenge than what I thought. But that does not, I think, release us from still pursuing the question. There was, of course, a time pre-COVID and some years ago, before we started to connect our conversations to that of the bigger platforms, that we really went into particular contexts, such as, for instance, in South Africa about 10 years ago, such as, for instance, in the USA and other parts of the world, where we could really immerse ourselves in particular situations. But there was a sense in which I was just kind of, it opened my eyes in terms of, all right, so this is not just a GRLI thing. But I think the question is very much alive. I think after our conversation now, I feel that I understand the question much better and also the implications of the question much better. But I'm not sure that we've come to the second question. How might we? And there's a sense in which I feel that we are better at understanding the first question and work with the first question, and not only just here amongst us, but the second question remains a challenge. I've also expressed in the group in which I was that, I mean, I'm an example of somebody who had the country where I live, had history on my side to a large extent, quite educated. Being part of a group of people who was in the political establishment. It's way different now. But I also need to learn how to shut up at the same time, because the scales have tipped. And if I can be so blunt, Salma and Armand have much, much more of a platform at the moment to speak in the South African context than what I have. And yet we need, in this particular environment, to keep on with the second question. How do we get beyond that first one? The second question, how might we? So I feel like it's a wonderful learning moment, you know, with the playing field so differently defined as what it was in the past. And perhaps it's a window of opportunity to use the time in which we're in at the moment to see how now and post-COVID we can again pursue this in much more practical terms. This is a bit of an artificial environment to have this kind of conversations.
Can I just add that one of the conversations we had in a previous pod was that the 50 Nobel laureates had been very good at raising all the questions and concerns and challenges, but had not actually put forward solutions as a collective or individuals. And so maybe we shouldn't be beating ourselves up at that, but we haven't got the answers. Because, you know, I do strongly believe in what I said about the sphere of influence, and as individuals, as a collective, you know, as a global community, that there is scope for change at whatever level, and that we shouldn't lose sight of that, even if it's in our own exchanges and our own practices and our own way of being with others and the influence that that may have on others.
At the end of our call in group 2, there was an exchange between Carol and Geeta to talk about, and as Geeta said very specifically, yes, she speaks up. She feels she's able to speak up, but look at the price she has to pay. And so that was the question that came up of, you know, we want to hear new voices, but what is the price that they have to pay for speaking up? And sometimes that price is death threats. Sometimes that price is futility. Sometimes that price is they've spoken and then someone else says the same thing later, but doesn't give them credit for it. Sometimes the price is just mental exhaustion. So what my response to what, to that second question is, those of us, I don't have to pay a price for speaking, which is why I talk all the time. And so those of us who don't have to pay a price can do a much, much, much better job of working within our own systems to figure out how do we lower the price of speaking up, and B, how can we pay attention in individual interactions when we ourselves are imposing a cost or when we see other people imposing a cost, and then use our voice to speak up against that. That is, a small effort, but if that can become a bit more normalized, then there can be progress on that front. But I think that question of who pays a price for speaking up is something that we need to pay attention to at the individual level and at the system level.
If I may add, I think we also need to, in that context or what we need to work with, it is to recognize the lingo or the language that we are talking. So speaking up is not just speaking, but how do we interpret the rules of the game and what the words are to be used. I mean, we need to be reflexive on our own kind of culture that might be, make people pay the price because they cannot. Well, they're not English speaking like myself, but I'm not big problems with not knowing all the words. But still, I mean, that's very easy. That's one of my first experience many years ago abroad. I wasn't just woman, and then by that time young, I was also non-English speaking or non-native. So I mean, there are many things we need to. I think in my own school too that we need to recognize that part of the price is we kind of demand the people that we say, please come and speak to know our language. And then literally, of course, or not literally, but even if they know Swedish, as in my case, they might not be trained in the way or brought up in academic environment and so on. So, and we need to be open and reflexive and see what kind of barriers do we put in that way. How to speak and kind of what is the way you express yourself or refer to in the environment.
I agree. I like that to maybe elaborate a bit more on that. I think it's wide range, right? We're talking from very extreme cases of what the price to pay is a death threat to microaggressions sometimes in very much in our sphere of influence that Carol was saying, right? So how can we be more like effective and mindful and conscious agent of change in like from our fear to actually, hopefully in some way to touch on those more extreme cases. But going to Marie's point here, sometimes are things like, language barriers, sometimes like the rules that she was saying, in terms of how we conduct business, what are the standards, the global standards, how things have to be done, but also the way that one can be perceived based on a lot of unconscious bias, right? In terms of like, whether it's gender issues or whether regional, racial, of how people are supposed to act, what we assuming of people come from, or how they should operate, right? Which makes the assumption of someone being, from like too bossy to too whiny to like, not bringing solutions, right? So how can we really be more open to the listening of what the other person is saying? Maybe I just wanted to say that, to be a bit more mindful, I guess, on all of the different shapes that takes form, but also on the subtleties and in our own sphere of influence.
Just to acknowledge, we have run over, but I'm keeping the room open for anyone who wants to continue, and I'll be here for as long as you're interested. It would be lovely to just hear some closing reflections from those of you who joined us for the first time, even if it's just a sentence. But we will we can continue the conversation by all means. So.
Let me say thank you, John. It was quite informative and energizing to be part of the conversations. Bob said something now at the end, which he said a lot of what he said obviously resonates in some ways with my experience as a Black academic coming into a white institution, right? And being in a space where people, you'd hope that more people who look differently to me, Bob, would speak up about these issues. And the price to pay is a really tough one. It's a hard one to pay. I mean, in the last 2 years, I think I've been extremely exhausted in talking about these things. And as I came in is pretty much how it is that my experience has been. I haven't necessarily, I don't think, grown in popularity, but it's not a popularity contest. But yeah, I just want to thank you, Bob, because in the beginning you said, you know, people that look like you should take a backseat, but that only becomes easier to do when there's more people that look like me, right? But that acknowledgement and what one does with that acknowledgement is even more important. And that's where I think the price for me and what it is that I feel can be done, you know, it doesn't, I get frustrated, I get despondent at times. And it's not a matter of scales or us and them, you know, just to come back to that point that I was making about being comfortable with being uncomfortable, you know. It's okay, we're all human beings. We look differently, we speak differently, but taking the time to actually understand what's behind the eyes, you know, I don't think we make enough time to do that. So thank you for the engagement. I learned quite a bit from everybody, and I look forward to remaining involved in whichever way I can.
Thanks, Armand. Any others joining us?
Just wanted to thank you, John and everybody else. It was lovely to be here. So much has been said. I'll think over it, I'll reflect. Yeah, thank you again. It flew in no time, so I feel a bit sad. It's nearly over. And lovely to meet you all. Thank you.
Thanks. You're welcome, Xenia. And I'm pretty sure we'll find some way of continuing this type of broadening of our conversation in some form or another. So I hope to see you again.
Me too. Thank you.
John, I just wanted to also say thank you very much. This has been, to everyone actually, this has been a very, very interesting conversation. And I think it has certainly brought up or brought to light many things that I will reflect on, but I like the openness of the conversation. And I think there's a lot that's being discussed that really does need to be discussed. I like what you said, Armand, about having those difficult conversations that don't sit so well in the pit of your stomach, because those are good ones to have. And we generally don't have those to the extent that we should. And I want to kind of echo what you were saying about the despondency of being in a space where your voice is not necessarily heard or not necessarily given the kind of weight that you would want it to. And, you know, reflecting on my experience as the only female, non-white on a board, is certainly an interesting one, and I think brings about a lot of those kind of challenges. And how do you navigate through that? I think what someone mentioned, I don't know who the lady was it Gita, about the price that you pay for what you say, whether it is in the best interests of the organization that you're working with, or whether it's in the best interests of the people that are there. The fact that it's not the right person saying it makes a big difference. And so I think there's good stuff coming out. And I think these are conversations that really need to happen, really need to think about. And I'm hoping, certainly from an African perspective, from a South African perspective, that these are the things that would change, or that we can work to influence to change through curricula, through engagement in our spheres, etc., because it's really important to do that. So I'm happy to definitely continue engaging. I think these are fantastic conversations to have. And I really enjoyed this first one. Thank you.
Thanks, Salma. Wonderful. Okay. So again, if any of you are interested in continued connection with GRLI, feel free to drop me a note. Yeah, Nola, please go ahead. Sorry.
Oh, no, I just wanted to thank everyone as well. I do have to go, and thank you, Jeff, for the invitation. This has been some really wonderful conversations and topics that, you know, I think we'll be bringing back, definitely, at least from my point of view, to our school and to our curriculum and what we're doing in developing our leaders. And Jeff is involved with our executive MBA program, and we're doing some interesting things and exploring a lot of these various topics. And so, you know, from the systems conversation to how we define and redefine our processes, I think is really important. So thank you, everyone. It was so great to be here. And these are the kinds of conversations we really need to have. And I do appreciate the openness and being able to, you know, hopefully teach that. And I think we do to our business students, especially in future leaders, is very, very important in today's climate. So again, thank you. And I wish I could stay, but I do have to go. But again, much gratitude and thank you.
Thanks, Nola. Thank you very much, Arnold.
John, I hope that the inclusion of people, I mean, I'm privileged today to be here with Armand and with Salma from Stellenbosch, and both of them play different roles. Armand followed me up as the head of social impact at Stellenbosch Business School. Salma is an alumnus and one of our upcoming academic stars in terms of lecturing and so on. And I've warned that many times before in conversations that one of our biggest challenges is that we institutionalize the GRLI relationship around people and not around institutions. Mm-hmm. And the moment that the person drops off, we lose the relationship with the organization or the institution. So I hope that that these invitations to the plus ones are not accidental. Incidentally, I am leaving USB in the formal sense at the end of this year. So I will have to be followed up by somebody else. So we are in that transition. But I also would like to raise the point and say that business schools, universities, other organizations being part of the GRLI should make sure that the relationship is not tied to an individual, but that it circles out more widely. And that I hope that this can become actually standard practice, and that people who are on this call today who are not normally here will and might return so that it's not a once-off. Yeah, so I just wanted to raise the point.
Thanks, Arnold. And also a timely reminder to everyone still on the call that our partners are encouraged to invite up to 20 people as independent associates, and those could be people internally to the organization, or if they're stakeholders beyond your organization's border that you wish to involve in the GRLI's conversation, you're more than welcome to do that. So, great. Okay. Thank you, Bob. Thank you, Armand and Salma, for joining us for the first time. Wonderful to have you here. And thanks, Florencia, for representing the Guardians and for opening and for welcoming. And yeah, just wonderful having this conversation. I think it's only the tip of the iceberg. Yes, we are thinking big, but I believe that what we're doing here is we are starting small and acting now. So with much gratitude, and please stay safe.
Thank you, everyone. Thanks, John.
Goodbye.
Everyone.
And then there were 3.